Hello everyone, welcome to the Narcissism Decoder. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Mazzella. In this episode, we're continuing our discussion on secrets. If you didn't get a chance to listen to part 1, I encourage you to check that out. But in case you missed it, in part 1, we began by reframing secrecy, not simply as deception, manipulation, or a moral failure, but as something much more psychologically meaningful. We talked about how within narcissistic organization, secrecy exists along a wide spectrum. It starts on one hand with ordinary omissions meant to people please. Somewhere in the middle, we said this is how secrets function as a way of managing shame, fear, and vulnerability. And then there are far more destructive secrets. These are far more encompassing, identity-splitting secrets that organize your entire life. We spent time with a clinical example, a man carrying a teenage arrest into adulthood, sealing it away in order to protect a fragile, grandiose self, only to have that past return through a failed background check, puncturing the false self and triggering a profound internal crisis. And we're going to see that in a little bit more detail in a moment. We'll go into it further. We left off with me saying that I wanted to dive even deeper into the psychodynamic meaning and consequences of secrets. So let's get right into it. So, what is this more comprehensive view into lying and secrecy? Psychodynamically, there's a deeper layer. These hidden parts of yourself are disavowed aspects of the self, painful feelings of inadequacy that the ego cannot integrate into its grandiose self-structure without fracturing the illusion of perfection, control, or omnipotence. Remember, that's the main structure that holds the narcissist together. This means secrecy isn't just manipulative or a power move. It protects not only your reputation and image, but also a fragile psychic equilibrium, and therefore can become a way of life or a big part of your life. Again, depending on where on that continuum, that spectrum you fall, right? Because on the more serious level of that continuum, on that serious end, then it encompasses your whole life. In the middle is somewhere like a big part of your life. But let me say that in a slightly different way, and then we'll get into an example. Secrets are not just withheld thoughts, feelings, and experiences. They're markers of what cannot be tolerated consciously: need, weakness, fear, longings, imperfections, and perhaps shame and guilt. And again, on the more serious level, remember that end of the continuum, a secret and an entirely false life of, and here you could fill in the blank, but a false life of what? Hidden romantic or sexual behaviors, such as a secret affair, or ongoing relationships kept from your partner, compulsive spending, such as hidden shopping binges or excessive credit card debt, or alcohol, prescription medication, or even recreational drug use that's hidden from loved ones, just to name a few. The secret symbolizes the disavowed other side of the self, and keeping it so often comes with a cost. So keeping the secret, it costs something. It costs distance, mistrust, and a persistent psychological tension that quietly limits authentic connection. All of this, the disavowed parts of the self, the fragile ego, the psychological tension, isn't just theory. It shows up in real life, in the moments we try to navigate relationships, work, and social expectations while keeping parts of ourselves hidden. Let's get right into the lived experience of this so I can demonstrate how this is not just theory. For many people, the secret doesn't just exist. It feels like, and I quote, I heard this from a patient of mine, like a dirty secret, something morally stained, hidden, and corrosive. As we were exploring in part 1, and I will continue to discuss this here, sometimes this shows up around a past arrest. That's what I just reviewed a moment ago. This fellow who had a past arrest failed a background check, and now needed to explain this to his fiancée. So in the past, you can imagine this, you have some sort of minor misdemeanor, and I say that symbolically. And here's what secrecy does with that minor misdemeanor, psychodynamically. It intensifies the internal persecution. When something is hidden, the mind loses the ability to test reality. The fear judgment remains unchallenged. There's no relational feedback, no soothing, no repair. So an internal persecutor forms, a voice that says something like this. If they knew, they see the real you, right? Well, the voice says they would see the real me, the ruined me. So the secret becomes a kind of private prison, maintained not by external guards, but by the fear of exposure, that they're going to see that you're tainted, flawed in some way. I once had a patient who literally called it the dirty secret. You could almost feel it as if it's a split-off object inside of him, a quarantine, toxic part of the self that had to be sealed away from anyone who might get close to him. And this is where we circle back to our earlier example, the fellow who got arrested in his teenage years for the minor misdemeanor. Unspoken, that teenage arrest becomes a split-off bad self-representation, which just basically means an image of oneself as bad, tainted, flawed. And that must be kept away from relationships. His partner gets the, and I quote, good self, the competent self, the lovable self. Meanwhile, that bad self lives underground, carrying all the shame. Now imagine what it feels like when the old arrest resurfaces through a failed background check. Suddenly the lie is alive again, visible, judged. The patient often experiences this as confirmation of the internal persecutor's message that you are bad and you must hide this. Psychodynamically, we might say something like this. When shame is carried alone, it becomes a deadly secret. When it is safely shared, and emphasis on the word safely, and I'll come back to this in a moment, it becomes a grief that can be held. And in the therapy room, this becomes the goal, to bring this split off, hidden part of the self to light. To deepen the work with this fellow, I might say something like this. It sounds like when you failed the background check, or when you were denied the TSA pre-check, or you could fill in the blank here, when you had the one-night stand, or when you ran up the credit card again. It didn't just bring up fear. It stirred something much deeper and more painful. Or I may say something like, when the past gets pulled into the present like this, it can feel like a part of you that works so hard to move on suddenly disappears. In other words, all good that existed in life disappears. Now you're up against or in front of the bad self that I mentioned earlier. And then gently, I may begin to wonder, sometimes out loud with a patient, I'm curious what this touched inside of you. The goal with this question is to help them get in touch, give voice to that split off part of the self. And it's here that I often hear people describe feeling seen as tainted, dirty, corrupt, bad, unlovable, or guilty, as though this one moment defines their entire being and self-worth. Now remember, the caveat here is one moment. This is very different than the other end of that continuum that I described a moment ago, where someone lives a completely separate life, like a false life. Anyway, so when I reflect back and I'm curious about what this touched inside of you, sometimes as they talk about this feeling of being corrupt or bad, this is the moment that tears come. Not because of the failed background check. I want to be very clear about that. But again, what I typically hear is something about how they have finally stopped carrying the secret alone. And that's the beginning of, and I'm quoting here, integrating something that secrecy, by design, it always has prevented integration. That's why I keep emphasizing the split off part of the self. When there are splits, there's no integration. So the goal is helping somebody like this begin to develop a more integrated sense of self. not the true versus false self that I mentioned in the prior episode. Contact with the real self brings with it, and I quote, shared emotional life, and therefore a loosening of that internal persecutor that tries to convince you that you are so bad and so tainted forever. The secret is no longer an isolated, exiled part of the psyche. It becomes something that can exist in his relationship with me rather than outside of it. His story gets told, again with those inquisitive questions that I mentioned a moment ago. Then, subsequently, by telling his fiancée the results of the failed test, he further integrates those parts of himself. This can feel relieving because the self is now more whole. That's the integrated self. Less managed, less curated, less false. It's an act of internal repair. In other words, the story gets told. It's not met with condemnation, which, of course, is the deepest fear. And because the feared response does not occur, the internal meaning of the story begins to shift. If it had been met with disgust, punishment, a lecture of some kind, think about it if you're a parent when a child comes to you and reveals that they did something or that they lied and you give them a lecture about how in this family we all tell the truth, not helpful, because that's when it's met with moral judgment. So if there's a lecture of some sort or any kind of judgment, the split is reinforced. And I quote, the bad self is confirmed as dangerous, unlovable, and deserving of punishment. The internal persecutor, that critical inner voice, would be strengthened. The psyche would learn, once again, that this part must remain hidden to survive. In other words, I never should have been honest. But that's not what happened here. He learns, maybe I'm not so bad. Maybe I could be known and still loved because first I'm accepting of the truth, and then it turns out his fiancée was quite accepting as well. And here is where you may be noticing some movement. From where? From secrecy to openness, from shame to shared humanity. In other words, we all make mistakes of some sort. From fear to trust, from splitting to integration, from concrete thinking to symbolized thinking, things that are thinkable and speakable are less traumatic. So just the acquisition of language, putting words to one's inner experience that was once sequestered, is part of moving from concrete to symbolization. Anyway, all of this suggests growth in the capacity for intimacy and self-acceptance. So at this moment, I want to have a little fun and play around with these concepts. But I should note, as we wrap this up and I play around with this, I want to discuss a key moment from the ending of The Beast in Me. If you prefer not to hear spoilers, this would be a good place to skip ahead or perhaps stop, because I'm going to do a spoiler alert here. I'm going to talk about The Beast in Me and how it ends. All of this talk about secrets and deception brings me to something that's actually been coming into the consulting room lately. Several patients have referenced the Netflix series, The Beast in Me, particularly one of the final scenes, not because of the crime itself, but because of what it captures psychologically. And this is one of the main points of this episode. What it's like to sit alone with a false, hidden self, and what happens when that secret can no longer be contained. Without getting into the full story, and again, this is the spoiler alert, the ending centers on a man who has been living a double life, a brutal killer who has carried out extreme violence while presenting as controlled, intelligent, and entirely ordinary to the outside world. The tension of the series builds around this split between what is carefully managed and performed and what is hidden, denied, and kept out of his relationships. And many of you may have experienced this. I hear this quite frequently where, just let's say, for example, a woman is telling me that her husband behaves very differently in public. He puts on his good face, his charming face, but then in private, he's actually quite agitated, angry, and aggressive. But in any matter, what's striking about the ending is how the secret finally comes out. He isn't exposed through force or evidence alone. He's drawn into confession through sustained psychological pressure, through being seen, questioned, and slowly cornered by someone who refuses to collude with the false self that he's been presenting. This is his wife, by the way, who's putting pressure on him to tell the truth. As the space for his performance collapses, something else emerges: agitation, cracks in control, a sudden and violent shift in tone. The confession isn't calm or reflective. It's loud, eruptive, laced with cursing and shouting, as if the words are being forced out under pressure rather than spoken, in that integrating way that I mentioned just a moment ago. And he screams, and I'm not going to curse here, but you could picture it: "I effing killed her." That's what comes out, but not as understanding, but as a discharge. And that's the point. The confession isn't relief. It's like a rupture. Once spoken, the secret doesn't integrate the self. So it's not like this is what's going to help this fellow, although it might help a little bit just to get this stuff out, cathartic in a way. But it destroys the very structure that allowed him to function. The grandiose, controlled self cannot survive once the disavowed self is forced into language without containment. And that may be the part you heard me emphasize earlier, that it initially came up with the fellow that I mentioned in the room in a containing way, and then subsequently with his fiancée. There's a lot more we can say about this confession, but the main point is the sense that secrets don't stay quiet. That's the main point I'm trying to emphasize here. They work on you from inside. They distort relationships, fuel paranoia, and embolden the internal persecutor that I mentioned earlier into something that gets exaggerated, and then finally something has to give. In other words, for many of you listening, the secret doesn't involve anything remotely like murder, and yet, psychologically, it can feel just as severe, as though being known would lead to the total rejection of you, your profession, and your entire existence. That's how the psyche works. Shame magnifies even smaller deceptions, the lies, omissions, and transgressions of daily life. And again, I'm not talking here about the extreme splitting and double life scenario I detailed earlier, or like in this case with this guy who was a murderer. And yet, even these I'm quoting, everyday secrets carry real risk, because they do. Being discovered can provoke condemnation, hurt, or rejection from those you care about. So that is true. I want to acknowledge that. But they're magnified in the mind until they feel unforgivable, as though being known would mean being cast out entirely and forever. Sometimes what matters most is not the content of the cover-up, but the terror of being seen, exposed, and humiliated. What I hope I demonstrated is, in contrast, when something shameful is spoken, first in the consulting room, and sometimes later in a relationship, it has the possibility of becoming thinkable, shareable, and therefore less traumatic. But of course, disclosure is not risk-free. That's the part I keep emphasizing. It can elicit hurt, anger, or rejection. And that very risk is part of the psychic tension that secrecy was meant to contain. So in other words, we keep it secret because there is a risk. But what I'm trying to capture is that risk oftentimes, with most secrets, gets exaggerated because of the way the psyche works it over in isolation. The risk gets magnified. As painful as this may be to hear, to truly engage with reality and relationships, there's no way to avoid some vulnerability. Psychodynamically, this frames disclosure not as and I quote, magical or a guaranteed way to feel safe or integrated, but as part of living in the real world, where relationships, work, and life all carry potential judgment. And yet, it is precisely through this vulnerability, the willingness to risk being seen, like the patient did with me, and then subsequently with his fiancée, that's what holds the potential for genuine connection, self-acceptance, and the possibility of a more authentic life. Okay, I hope you found this 2-part series on secrecy and lying meaningful. If something I said resonated with you, unsettled you, or even left you feeling confused, I'd really like to hear about it. Those reactions often point us towards something more important. There is still so much more to say on this topic, especially the double life and the extreme forms of splitting. This is the stuff that I mentioned all the way on the other end of the continuum. The extreme forms of splitting that can develop around secrecy. That's a different psychological beast, and one that we'll have to come back to. If you're interested, let me know. As always, thank you for spending this time with me. Bye for now. If this spoke to you and you're curious to learn more about all issues related to narcissism, please support the show by subscribing so you don't miss what's coming next. And even more importantly, take a moment to leave a review. Reviews make the podcast easier for others to find, which helps the show grow. The more the show grows, the more I can invest in creating thoughtful content that supports you in understanding and navigating your experiences with narcissism. Okay, thanks for being here with me. I'm grateful we got to explore this one together. Until next time, take care of yourself. Bye for now. Disclaimer alert. The Narcissism Decoder podcast is provided for general information purposes only. The content presented in this podcast is not intended to diagnose, treat, or cure any psychological condition related to narcissism. The content on this podcast should not be considered a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. For specific advice pertaining to narcissism or any other psychological condition, you could reach me directly. I am an experienced mental health practitioner who is always taking on new patients. If you would just like a consultation, I can do that too.